a nice bar. Like, I like this room.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful hotel.
Yeah, I've never been to this hotel.
Can everyone do attention, please? Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Cherise Palomino, and I'm the organizing director at Unite New York, a nonprofit movement seeking to build a better and stronger democracy in New York. Thank you for joining us for what I think is one of the most important conversations we can have about the future of democracy in our state. Tonight's discussion is an educational conversation about a landmark voting rights case and what communities across New York can learn from it. Unite New York does not currently have a ranked choice voting proposal for the city of Albany, nor are we supporting any existing ranked choice proposals for the city. Our goal for tonight is to foster informed public dialogue by examining successful examples of election reform and exploring the legal, civic, and community building strategies behind them. Tonight, we're talking about something that many people assume is impossible: changing the rules of our elections. Yet in the town of Newburgh, through a groundbreaking legal challenge under the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York, a community successfully secured a new electoral system using proportional ranked choice voting, a decision that has implications far beyond Newburgh. We're fortunate tonight to be joined by the two attorneys who led that effort, David Imamura and Amy B. Marion. Tonight, we'll explore not just what happened in Newburgh, but why it matters, how the case unfolded, and what lessons communities like Albany can take from this historic victory. Please join me in welcoming David and Amy.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you, United New York, so much for having us. Thank you to Argus Hotel. I've never actually been here just like coming to Albany for years, so this is a lovely space. Thank you to the staff, and thank you everyone for coming on a rainy evening. So I'm David Omora. I am a partner at Abrams Fensterman, where I specialize in election and municipal law. I also am a Westchester County legislator, and prior to that, I was chair of the New York State Independent Redistricting Commission. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks so much for coming.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Amy Marion. I'm also a partner at Abrams Fensterman. I'm not going to go through my whole resume. Started years ago in New York City Public Defender's Office and had a lot of different jobs along the way. And I'm a litigator, and I litigate human rights, civil rights, constitutional issues, and that's how I got involved in the case.
Thank you. We want to talk a little bit about the background, what the circumstances were that led to this lawsuit. For those who may not be familiar with the case, can you briefly walk us through what was happening in Newburgh that ultimately led to this lawsuit?
Yeah, so, do you want to talk about the New York State Voting Rights Act first, or do you want to just talk about the municipalities? So in 2022, Governor Hochul signed the New York State Voting Rights Act. So this was in response to the erosion of the Federal Voting Rights Act on the national level. And the state legislature and the governor said, not here, not in New York, right? We need to stand up for people's voting rights. And so they passed the New York State Voting Rights Act. And one thing that it did was that it created a claim for for vote dilution arising from racially polarized voting. And we're going to get into like the exact details on that in a second, right? But effectively what it does is that if there's a community of color that meets certain thresholds, but is unable to have a voice in their government, they can sue to alter the electoral system to give them a seat at the table. So in the town of Newburgh, which is 40% Black and Hispanic, they had never once elected a candidate supported by the Black and Hispanic communities. They had never once elected a Black or Hispanic person to the town board. And this is a community, again, that was 40% Black and Hispanic. And people say, well, what does that matter? It matters a lot, because if the Black and Hispanic communities are just systematically excluded from their town government, that has huge impacts, right? I have subscribed to the Newburgh town email list, and I've noticed that the boil water notices that go out are predominantly in Black and Hispanic parts of the town. right? When there was, when the city was pushing asylum seekers to different parts of New York, they sent it to the town of Newburgh, right? There was a story saying that that homeless veterans were being displaced by asylum seekers, and this literally made Fox News, and then it turned out that this was completely fake and that it was not happening. And despite that, local Republican elected officials were happy to get their 15 minutes in the sun to talk on Fox News, right? So these were folks who were being elected by the town of Newburgh, and yet clearly did not represent the interests of 40% of the town. And I also want to flag that this was not just the town of Newburgh. Another Voting Rights Act claim that we brought was against the town of Mount Pleasant, where similarly it was 20% Hispanic, had never elected a candidate of color, had never elected, only once had elected a candidate supported by the Hispanic community. And the town of Mount Pleasant literally passed a law where you could literally go to jail if you housed a migrant. Right? So these were places that were passing laws that were clearly affecting communities of color, and yet communities of color could have no voice. And that is what was happening. Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
you want
Yeah.
to ask a different question? Sorry. Or do you want me to go into the differences?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Before this case, what barriers were communities facing under the existing system?
So as David said, the barriers are not having a voice at the election, at the polls, not having a voice in the government of the town. I mean, I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, I think. I've spoken to some of you. You're all coalition and community activists, I think, so you all sort of know what you do in your communities. There's environmental justice issues that were affecting the town of Newburgh. The town of Newburgh also, our clients, these plaintiffs, were individuals who were politically active. They were former law enforcement, some of them. They were former military. They had religious connections. I mean, these people had, really been a part of the fabric of this country, this nation. Many of them were commuting 2 hours each way to go to the city for work. They came to Newburgh for a better life. And like David said, they were not getting representation at all. And these individuals were not staying home. They were organizing in their political parties. They were showing up at town board meetings when in EO 203, the executive order for police reform throughout this state was passed. They were going to the meetings and they were asking what the town was doing about police reform. The executive order required, it was the governor's executive order that required municipalities to develop a police reform plan that was inclusive of the entire community. And pursuant to that order, the municipality was required to engage and put together a group of stakeholders. All of our plaintiffs were significant stakeholders in this community, and not one of them was asked to be on this police reform committee. Many towns, as many of you know, develop master plans. The master plans are for zoning and for, how you want, your town to look in terms of long-term land use planning. These individuals showed up at these meetings. They wanted more affordable housing. They wanted to change the zoning in many places. They were unilaterally shut out at every aspect of their community.
Thank you. I want to go back to the New York State Voting Rights Act, David. You were talking about it briefly. Can you just, when people hear the New York State Voting Rights Act, oftentimes they think of the Federal Voting Rights Act. Can you just briefly give a little bit of a difference between what the State Voting Rights Act is versus the more commonly known Federal Voting Rights Act?
So the Federal Voting Rights Act, until recently, had what's called the three jingles factors, right? Which the United States Supreme Court has subsequently completely changed, right? But before times, there were the three jingles factors. One of them is that you have to be able to create a majority-minority district in order to be able to force a redraw, right? So, for example, in the town of Hempstead in Nassau County, right, there was a town council, I think 6 seats, right? You could create one majority black seat. And so as a result, they were able to sue and compel, under the Federal Voting Rights Act, creating a majority black seat. Problem with that, though. What if the community of color is kind of uniformly distributed around the town, right? What happens if they aren't concentrated in a single place, right? Does that then mean that they're systematically unable to access the equality and the representation that the Federal Voting Rights Act demands, right? The answer to that is yes, they couldn't do that until the New York State Voting Rights Act. So the New York State Voting Rights Act eliminates what was the first shingles factor, that you have to create a majority-minority district, right? In the town of Mount Pleasant, we were pretty close. I mean, you could draw a 49% Hispanic district. Like I remember drawing the maps, right, and saying, okay, you can draw a 49% Hispanic district, but not enough under the Federal Voting Rights Act, right? Town of Newburgh, right, the population was kind of more distributed, right? So even though the whole town is 40% Black and Hispanic, you could draw a 45% Black and Hispanic district, right? So that's kind of that's the main difference between the two laws, right? Is that the New York State Voting Rights Act tried to address this issue that people do not live in boxes, right? People live in communities, and that does not necessarily mean that they're all concentrated in the same place.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about the legal framework and building the case now that you've given us some background. What made proportional ranked choice voting the appropriate remedy instead of simply redrawing district lines? But first, can you explain what proportional ranked choice voting actually is and how it differs from other RCV models, say like the RCV model that exists in New York City?
So
Well, I can do the first step.
okay.
You have to do the second.
So taking multiple steps back, right? So does everyone know what ranked choice voting is? Okay, right. So ranked choice voting, you take a ballot and you rank all the candidates 1 through 8, 1 through 10, right? And then if you do it like it is in New York City, right? There's a single winner at the end, right, of the primary. If one candidate in the initial ballot fails to get 50%, you will eliminate candidates one by one, and then their votes are redistributed to the candidate, right, until someone gets 50% of the vote. Proportional ranked choice voting is when there's multiple seats that are up, right? So instead of there being a single winner, in this case, in the town of Newburgh, there are 2 seats, right? And so what happens is you rank the candidates, and then if someone gets above the threshold, those votes are then proportionately redistributed to the candidates that they rank second, right? Similarly, if someone fails to get above the threshold, those votes are redistributed, right? But because it's a single vote, right? So let's say there's 2 seats. Since you have a single vote that's being redistributed, this ensures that minorities are able to get a seat at the table, right? Because then a single party is not monopolizing everything, right? My favorite reflection of this is that there was a reporter who used Skittles to like simulate the redistribution of the votes, right? But what this does is especially on bodies with multiple seats, it ensures that it ensures that 51% of the community is not able to have 100% of the power, right? Which is what was happening in Newburgh under at-large elections, what was happening in Mount Pleasant under at-large elections. Now, to the second part of your question, how is proportional ranked choice voting? Why did we not draw districts? I'll be completely honest, my preference was districts, right? And in Mount Pleasant, we ultimately did draw districts, right? What ended up happening was that the town of Newburgh's attorneys indicated that they did not want to draw districts. They felt that drawing districts divided up the town in a way that they didn't feel was productive. They thought there was one town, there should be one town election. And we said, well, if that's how you feel, there's multiple systems that accomplish what we are hoping to accomplish, giving minorities a seat at the table, but also accomplishes what you're trying to accomplish, which is keeping the town together. This includes cumulative voting, this includes ranked choice voting. So I remember this, there was that giant blizzard earlier in the year where it like snowed like 6 feet, although in Albany, I'm sure you guys are like, that's nothing. Right? But you know, it basically shut all of Westchester down, and we had trial on Monday, and it was Saturday, and it was starting to snow, and I remember getting a phone call from opposing counsel, right, when we're getting ready for trial, and I remember getting a call from opposing counsel, and they said, we accept your proposal for ranked choice voting. and then we said, okay. And then it was figuring out everything in terms of execution, right, in terms of attorneys in under 36 hours, right? So here, I'll hand it over to Amy.
Okay, so I'm going to go back a little bit.
Yeah.
So in terms of the difference between the Federal Voting Rights Act, the Gingell's factors in New York State, as David was explaining, with the Federal Voting Rights Act, you have to show majority vote, the minority votes is large enough and votes cohesively. You also have to show that there's a majority that always votes to take away the minority's vote, right? So they always win, the white majority always wins. And also you have to show totality of the circumstances. Critically, in New York State, the difference is that you have to show either vote dilution or totality of the circumstances, okay? Now, in addition to that, that's how you show vote dilution, either by racially polarized voting or by totality of the circumstances. You don't have to show all the Gingell's factors. So that's critical in New York State. The other thing, though, is you have to show that there's an alternative remedy, right? Obviously, you have to, not obviously, I shouldn't say, but you know, when I explain it, it's going to seem very obvious. If you don't have an alternative remedy that's better than what's working, then you can't show that there's a disparate impact with what's going on, right? Or at least it's harder to show. So that's why there are what we say alternative remedies. And there are multiple alternative remedies. There's not just, there's ranked choice voting, there's proportional ranked choice voting, and there's other remedies. So how do you say which is the best remedy? Well, in this case, we knew that anything's better than at large, right? And also drawing like single districts, right? That's better. But what is clear, what the studies do show, and I think I was saying this before, it's not a matter of the lawyers, it's not a matter of the politicians. These are, when you read the studies on ranked choice voting, specifically, and I've read these studies there, it's statisticians that are studying this. It's math. And that's what's being studied. And these are very hard analyses. They come out of Burlington, where my son's from. They come out of San Francisco. They come out of Minnesota. A lot of times they do it through exit polls. There are different minority populations. There's different districting. There's different number of candidates. There's different demographics, economics, factors, what went into the electoral process and the political process at the time. But what you know, and what the studies uniformly show, these are the science, right? The scientists, the statisticians show, is that when you have ranked choice voting and proportional ranked choice voting, then minority candidates do get their say in the electoral process and they get elected. And that's what's significant. And all of those factors that I just said about those studies, I know you're going to ask questions later about open primaries, that's kind of the same issues that come into play. So I think I answered the question. I don't know.
I just have a quick follow-up. You mentioned at large. Can you explain briefly what an at-large election is?
You go.
So an
Better
at-large
explaining.
election is where everyone in the town votes versus having districts, right? So in the state of New York, you vote at large for the governor of the state of New York, right? Instead, but for legislatures, you have districts, right? So that's the difference between at large and districts. Yeah. or
And in
some other
town of
system.
Newburgh, the entire town was voting for the entire board.
As
so-
was the town of Mount Pleasant. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so that's why we thought if there were single districts, that at least you could have, that's how you create coalitions, right? So at least, like if we had one or two districts, we know that we could at least get one or two board members elected. And as David had said and was pushing for, he's also a legislator, so he understands. He's like, if we have 2 seats at the table, that is significant in terms of getting, legislation and policy and,
Right.
and getting things done.
Thank you. Was there a moment during the litigation where you realized this case could become precedent for other municipalities in New York?
Well, so I'm going to give a plug to my friend Michael Pernick at the Legal Defense Fund, who helped write this law. And I remember it was primary day 2022, and I was having dinner with him, and he told me, David, there's this thing called the New York State Voting Rights Act that's about to go into law. And he said, and it eliminates the first jingles factor. And I remember pausing and saying, Mount Pleasant, right? Because as chair of the State Redistricting Commission, I knew the political geography of the state, reasonably well, and I could, right? And racially polarized voting, which is one of the factors that Amy was discussing, is basically, are there communities of color, right, that are voting for a certain set of candidates that are systematically losing? And so, if you spent a lot of time, like I did, looking at maps of the political geography in New York State, I could just immediately say, okay, go to this municipality. And I realized that this law could completely change the political geography of the state, could completely change how people were able to elect their representatives, could completely change people's ability to get a seat at the table. And so, based off of that, I went to our firm, who generously agreed to go forward with this. And I remember, so the first step of filing one of these cases is you have to send a notice, a demand letter to the municipality saying, hey, we think you're in violation of the statute, and you need to look into action. And I remember going, usually, a law firm, you'd have a paralegal or something send this, and I remember saying, I'm going to do this myself. And I remember going to the mailbox and putting it into the mailbox and closing it, and knowing that I had just started the first case ever under the New York State Voting Rights Act, and knowing that this was something that under any scenario was going to, at a minimum, end up at the highest court in the state of New York. And knowing that we had just initiated a process that would potentially enfranchise thousands and thousands of people. So from that, so I knew from that moment that this was something we could do. Yeah.
It's amazing.
Okay.
So I want to just, so David got these plaintiffs together, and this is going a little bit off script, I'm sorry, Sharice, but it's important. Because I've done legislative reform also in the past, and now I'm a commissioner on the New York State Commission for Prosecutorial Conduct. And I remember when we were legislating or trying to get this passed, there's stories about those who were wrongfully convicted, right, and what happens. And so this story of these plaintiffs, Ernie Tirado is a man who has been involved in the politics in town of Newburgh for decades, showing up at meetings, does not want to have these, these factories that are polluting, disparately in the minority communities. He's showing up for police reform. Grace Perez, Puerto Rican descent, was, while we were getting ready to do depositions, is down in Puerto Rico taking care of her mother. She moved out of New York City to give her family a better life. She was the chair of, a New York City agency. She raised her children. She raised her grandchildren in the town of Newburgh to give them a better life. And all she saw was that every time that she went to the polls, she was not getting her voice heard. She would have to get calls from the Hispanic community because nothing was translated. And so she would have to go down to town hall and translate for them because there wasn't even anything translated into Spanish. There wasn't anybody who spoke Spanish. There wasn't anybody, as they said, being our plaintiffs of color, nobody who looked like us at town hall, so nobody could speak for us. These are individuals who were trying to pay their taxes, or they're trying to do some land use issue, or they're trying to pay a traffic ticket. There's consequences for, pleading guilty, right? And what happens, and none of that was ever translated. One of our plaintiffs was a New York City lieutenant, and she had to go to her neighbor who was stopped by the cops, who had just moved in and bought his house, and was stopped by the cops because they were accusing him of burglarizing his own home. And she had to go down to the police department and say, you need to retrain, you need diversity training here. I mean, this is what these people were, and they are amazing human beings. I mean, one of our plaintiffs was somebody who was, wrongfully accused of and was detained for that was the guy who was accused of burglarizing his own home. And these stories of these individuals and what they're living every day, it's enough dealing with discrimination in this country, but the fact that they go to the polls and they can't, in their little town, and they can't even get one person elected after, hundreds of years of this town. Sorry, I just had to go off a little, but I think it's important to know
Thank you.
who these people
So
are.
speaking of the lack of representation, what were the biggest legal misconceptions about ranked choice voting that you encountered?
Well, so like I said, right, I wouldn't say there were many legal misconceptions, right? I mean, we went to the town and we presented these options, and they came back and we said, we accept this option. And I hope that they did not have any legal misconceptions about how proportional ranked choice voting works. I mean, I think the hardest thing, at least for me, is explaining it to people, right? Because it is difficult to explain, because it is objectively difficult to understand, right? And so that is, for me, what's been difficult is, and I wouldn't say people have misconceptions. People just want to know how it works, right? Yeah.
I do think that a lot of people don't understand that it gets minorities elected. And I do think that that's a misconception. I also worked on ranked choice voting when it was going in New York City Council. And I think a lot of the misconceptions were that people can't be educated about it, right? I think that's also very racist, quite frankly, and discriminatory. That, in New York City, there's a million languages we needed to put it in, right? And so, you had to have it in Korean, Russian, whatever, and a million different languages. And it's like, okay, well, that's not hard. Just do it. You have everybody who speaks these languages. And they're like, well, it's so complicated. It's not complicated. It's complicated as a conceptual concept, maybe, but when you're going to the polls, it's easy to say, everybody knows, what's your favorite ice cream? Chocolate, vanilla, straw. I mean, it's just rank them. We do it all the time, right? That's not hard. So I really think the process, I think if that's the legal misconception, it's that individuals can't learn it.
Thank you. Were there any arguments from the city or from opponents that surprised you?
From the town of Newburgh, not really, right? We actually discussed this before. I think that what did surprise me was how much they fought.
Yes.
Right. So in the town of Mount Pleasant, they hired an expert after we sent our initial demand letter. They hired an expert that said, you are in violation of this law. You are in violation of this law. You can either spend millions of taxpayer dollars defending your own power, or you can give minorities a voice in your government, right? And so the other element of this is there's a fee shifting provision under the statute, right? So if plaintiffs win, then the town or the municipality has to pay the attorney's fees, right, of the plaintiffs. So that doubles the fees, right? And so, in the final analysis, I think ultimately the town of Newburgh spent almost $4 million on this, right? Both for plaintiffs' attorney's fees as well as their own fees, right? Because they hired I'm sure they're watching this right now. They hired Troutman Pepper, which is nationally renowned law firm, some of the best lawyers in the country, right? And then the town of Mount Pleasant hired Baker Hostetler, where the main person the partner that they brought on was the former general counsel of the Republican National Committee, and he was, I think, $1,600 an hour. And I remember we calculated this, and ultimately every man, woman, and child in each of these municipalities paid like $50 or $60 for this, all for politicians to keep their own power, right? And so that's what surprised me. There wasn't a legal argument surprised me, but what surprised me how hard they fought.
I agree along the lines of what David said about how hard they fought. So in New York, under the Voting Rights Act, in order to prove racially polarized voting, the statute provides for factors to consider. Factors to consider are what's more probative, as we say in the law, which is more important, right? So what's more probative is to show racially polarized voting is to show that the elections that occurred prior to the elections that occurred after the action was brought are not as probative, right? The ones that occurred before, you actually bring the action. Like, in other words, just because you change it, which is a very different thing in terms of the law, because usually the law does not like to penalize municipalities who change their policies after an action is brought, because we want to be in the habit of saying, oh, good, you saw you did something wrong and you changed it. This is interesting because under the New York State Voting Rights Act, it's more probative the elections beforehand. It's more probative the elections of the individual candidates that you're challenging, their particular elections. And what's probative is statistics, right? So in this case, and so you have expert reports from the statisticians, right? Because they do the calculations on whether or not there's actually racially polarized voting, and they look at all the elections. We had an expert report that showed that there was racially polarized voting. The plaintiff's expert did not dispute that. Defendants did not dispute that. So, and this was early on in the case. So David just explained about how much money was spent early on in the case, and this is pretty extraordinary under the law. Like, that's what it comes down to. It comes down to the statisticians, not the lawyers. Is there racially polarized voting or not? That's it. The experts say yes, and their expert said, I'm not disputing that. Yet they continued to fight and litigate this case because we believe they wanted to get up to the Supreme Court, and they wanted to challenge it constitutionally. That's how they wanted to challenge it and get it kicked out.
So you mentioned that they wanted to challenge this against the Supreme Court. Is this settled law for the town of Newburgh?
Yes, there's a settlement law in the town of Newburgh. We reached the settlement. The settlement is in effect, right? It's been entered into court. We went to the New York Court of Appeals, which found that a municipality lacked the capacity to challenge the constitutionality of the statute, right? So we're comfortable with this. I remember, there were these questions right after the most recent U.S. Supreme Court decision about, whether our, settlement still stood. And I know the town of Mount Pleasant, similar, I'm sure, was having these questions too, and they sent out an email to the whole town saying the settlement is still valid.
Thank you. I want to go beyond the legal strategy. Who were the key stakeholders in making this possible? I know you mentioned some of your clients.
Yeah.
I spoke about
Yeah, Amy talked about it. We had amazing plaintiffs, right? They were involved with the community. They had they had supported candidates. And one thing that united them was that no matter how hard they worked, no matter how many doors they knocked, no matter how many voters they talked to, they just were never able to elect someone who represented their interests, right? Despite making up 40% of the time. I remember, Amy mentioned him, Ernie Tirado, who was a FDNY, I think, battalion chief, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's retired, right? And this is a guy who literally ran into burning buildings to save people, right? And yet he could not get representation for the community he believed in the town of Newbury. And he told me about how the first time they ran a candidate for town board of color, this was like the first time ever that the town of Newburgh had a competitive election. And he was saying how the incumbents sent out a notice saying they were having a party at town hall to tabulate the results. And it wasn't clear to him whether this was for everyone or just one party. So he decided he would go, and everyone was there basically taunted him about how the election results went, right? Because the incumbents won. And I remember him saying it felt like there was a sheet of glass between him and the community he lived in. And now today, because of this lawsuit, he will have representation. And so we had these amazing plaintiffs who understood the stakes, right? Who understood that this was a lawsuit to give representation to people who had never had representation, and who understood it on a civic level, who understood on a policy level how it would impact the communities they represented, who understood on a political level how it would impact.
Thank you. Successful voting rights cases aren't won by lawyers alone. How important was coalition building in making this outcome possible?
So important. The aspect of the case that I dealt with, because I'm not the election law expert, I think David is, and our partners were the election law clinic at Harvard. So the other part that you have to, right, if you either show racially polarized voting or you show totality of the circumstances. Totality of the circumstances is the history of discrimination and disparate impact in the community. And what happened here was that we were able to build a great case for totality of the circumstances because individuals, not only the stakeholders, but the coalitions that they surrounded themselves with. These are religious coalitions, these are political coalitions, these are former law enforcement, former FDNY. Ernie, who we were talking about, he actually challenged discriminatory practices at FDNY. So these individuals all, had, and there was one of our plaintiffs whose wife ran a business, and so, he was just he just came from he came from a place where just going to town hall to try and deal with like a property issue with my neighbor. And so all of these, there was other individuals who were more involved with the migrant issue in the community, with the migrant hotel. There were other individuals who were more involved with the environmental justice issues. But getting all of these coalitions to come together, or these, not necessarily cohesive groups prior, but to come together, made such a difference.
And Amy mentioned them, but I do want to also recognize, like, it was not our law firm alone. Our co-counsel was the election law clinic at Harvard Law School, and this case could not have happened without their assistance. We do practice law in New York, but we by no means are Federal Voting Rights Act experts, right? But they brought the expertise to do this. The two people we worked with the most were Ruth Greenwood, who is the director of the center, and her husband Nick Stephanopoulos, who argued the case before the Court of Appeals. And this group will appreciate this. There's actually a documentary entitled "Slaying the Dragon" about gerrymandering, and I actually believe it's free on YouTube if you Google it. And there, Ruth and Nick play a very prominent role because they were the attorneys in the anti-gerrymandering lawsuit that reached the United States Supreme Court. And so I remember when I was referred to them, and by the way, this is the documentary that I showed my wife when I became chair of the State Redistricting Commission, to demonstrate how important gerrymandering and redistricting was, right? And to the point where she actually remembered these folks when I said that they were becoming our co-counsel. But I just want to recognize them, because we could not have done this without them. And I want to thank Ruth, I want to thank Nick, Dan Hessel, and Sam Davis, and their students, right? And I said to many of these Harvard Law students, this is the coolest thing you will ever do in your career, right? It's come to this. Like, you go practice corporate law, you will never have something more interesting than this. But it was their expertise and their knowledge that really brought this case forward. So I just want to recognize it. And the last time that Amy and I drove up to Albany was actually when the Court of Appeals case was argued. And Nick Stephanopoulos did a great job with that. So I just want to recognize that.
Thank you. Looking back, what did community members do particularly well that other cities like Albany should emulate?
Do you want?
Sure, you're getting good plaintiffs that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about our plaintiffs a lot. I mean, they were just really incredible. I mean, I think also they understood, right? I mean, the issue, one thing that when I was chair of the State Redistricting Commission, I would just say flat out to people who came to us, what do you want, right? Like, it's not for me as the chair of this redistricting commission to tell you what your communities are like, to tell you what policy interests need to be united in a single district. And similarly, we said the same things to our plaintiffs and to people in Newburgh and Mount Pleasant. What do you want? And the thing is that if you don't have an answer to that, there's nothing that the lawyers can do, right, to figure that out, right? Like, it's not for me at a Westchester law firm to tell you what your district should be like, to tell you what electoral system you should adopt, right? And so we had plaintiffs who were able to tell us, these are the interests that exist, these are the interests that have been excluded.
I'm going to answer that. In terms of getting that done and whether it's litigating or whether it's through referendum or trying to get that passed, I think it's very important. I think obviously the youth has the energy and the vigor to move a lot of this, but you need the historic knowledge of individuals who have lived in those communities and who have not gotten their voices heard. But also, in a very important way, there's a record of those individuals in those municipalities. They show up at meetings. I was able to pull the transcripts and the minutes from planning board meetings, zoning board meetings, town council meetings, the police reform meetings. So I was able to pull, because they're all on all your municipalities' websites and they go back for years, and people show up and they talk. And these plaintiffs showed up and they were there. And so there's, for a lawyer, the record evidence of the history of these individuals showing up and asking for police reform, asking for change, not being picked to be on the stakeholders committee and being completely ignored. So that's an important thing in terms of coalition and community building, is definitely getting the individuals who have, or just getting the transcripts, even if those individuals aren't there or not around. But if you pull the minutes from, there's documentary evidence of what goes on in in your municipalities that go back way, way, way back. And those are the records that are kept.
Thank you. We often hear concerns that RCV can harm Black political power by splitting the vote or making it harder for Black leaders to maintain influence. How does RCV actually protect and expand the voice of minority communities?
So I will say, right, that as was said before, right, I personally, going into this, preferred districts, right? It was the town came back and said, this is what we accept, right? And so we kind of didn't have any leeway in deviating from that. But that being said, right, the reason why we proposed it was because it was a system that worked, right? Now, in the general election, right, and an at-large system, communities of color got zero representation ever in the town of Newburgh. Not a single time in 50 years did they elect a person of color to the town board, right? In the election, in the middle of the lawsuit, there was an election. A Black woman did win the election, but that was after she went around saying, guess how much money the town of Newburgh is spending of your money to try to defend their own power. And there were 2 seats up, one person won, one person lost by 1 vote.
And everybody knew about the
Right,
lawsuit.
everyone knew about the lawsuit.
Everybody
Yeah,
knew.
everybody knew about the lawsuit, right? So we would not have accepted this system if it didn't work, right? Now, right, like, in the math shows it works, right? We literally had statisticians, doing these ridiculously complicated statistics to show that work, right? And just intuitively, right, in a proportional ranked choice voting system where votes are redistributed, right, but you have only 1 vote, then what's going to happen is that minorities are going to be able to get representation, right? Now, I will say, I'll be the first to say that for me, this was a system that worked in this moment. That's not to say that proportional ranked choice voting will work in all scenarios, right? But this was a system that worked in this moment for what we were trying to deal with, right? And notice that we, in Mount Pleasant, right, we accepted districts. Now, similarly, the town came to us with their system with a map that was drawn, right? Had they come to us and said, we want to do proportional ranked choice voting, we would also have accepted that, right? So I would be the first to say, right, that this system works, right? Look at the math, right? Look at the places that have adopted it. But I would also say, right, that this was a product of what the town was willing to accept, right? Because that was what the town wanted, was to keep the town whole.
No, it's just what I said before. There are multiple remedies that, that do provide representation at the, in the electoral process for minorities.
Thank you. To maximize our time, we asked for questions in advance. So I'm going to ask a few questions that were submitted. From Georgie O'Brien, this was a long one. So, as a Native American of the Mohawk and Cree, I am curious about your opinion regarding the voting rights, particularly as the Trump administration is doubling down on birthright citizenship issue. Native Americans were not legal citizens until 1927. The Trump administration argued in front of the Supreme Court that we have no loyalty to the United States because we have legal sovereignty and tribal governments, and therefore should be stripped of U.S. citizenship. After a 6-3 decision, they vowed to find other paths to denying our rights as citizens, including voting, obviously. What outreach have you done to our reservations here in the state, and what obstacles do you see, if any, for organizing Indigenous peoples and tribes?
Well, so to be clear, the New York State Voting Rights Act is available to almost any racial group, right? So it's available to Native Americans. It's available to people who are not of racial minorities, right? It's available to any racial group. Birthright citizenship for me is very personal, right? My grandfather actually came to America only because he got a special exemption from the Chinese Exclusion Act. He was a British sailor during World War II. His ship was torpedoed by a German submarine, and he was on a raft for 133 days, living on fish and seagulls. Not relevant to the New York State Voting Rights Act, right? But when the time came and he wanted to come to America, he couldn't because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it actually took a special act of Congress for him to come to America. And as the first Asian American county legislator, I think about him every day. And I think that's one of the reasons I think I am very passionate about this work, right, is getting people representation, right? So if Georgie would like to talk, very happy to talk, right? I mean, but this is a law that's available to anyone and everyone in the state of New York.
No, I was just thinking of a story that, so David's not a litigator, and when we were on for trial the first time, because the case went for trial the first time, and David mentioned the Harvard Election Law Clinic people, so their Nick does appellate advocacy, and he argued in the appeals court. I was the lead trial counsel. There was no question that I was going to be the one doing a lot of the examination, but Ruth Greenwood also, who's trial counsel. What's amazing about them is that they defer to us as New York lawyers, New York evidence. They wanted me to be lead trial counsel. They were incredible. So Ruth and I were handling most of the examination, and then one other person, Daniel Hessel, was also going to do some of the examination. There were a lot of witnesses. But David, and it's not just about what the story he told, but I mean, David was so passionate about this. This was David's idea. This was David got these plaintiffs together, and we were all trying to decide, well, who's going to do the opening statement, which, you know, big deal. It's a first impression on the court and everything else. And it was going to be another partner from my law firm, and I just spoke up and I said, no. I said, David needs to be the one to do the opening statement and to tell this story. And he did an incredible, incredible job. And I know that's not really answering your question, it's not really answering that individual's question, but we are more than happy to talk with you. And anybody has a right to access to any of the guarantees that our forefathers placed before us. So we are more than happy because we don't stop fighting no matter who's trying to crush us down. So.
Thank you. This question is from Riley Hart, who's not here. The Newburgh victory has provided a blueprint for reform. What are the baseline requirements for a municipality to qualify for this approach? If we are researching other cities, are at-large elections and minority vote dilution the only two must-haves, or are there other demographic and electoral thresholds we need to identify to build a winning case?
So under, you know, we discussed this before, right? Under the New York State Voting Rights Act, you require either show a demonstration of racially polarized voting or totality of the circumstances. Now, one thing we haven't discussed is that municipalities can voluntarily change their electoral systems to comply with the New York State Voting Rights Act, right? So a municipality can, you know, if it's been approached, right, or even if it hasn't approached, can say, prepare a report to the Attorney General saying, we believe we are in violation of the New York State Voting Rights Act. We want to change our electoral system, and this is what we want to change it to, right? The New York Attorney General will review it and either approve it or change it, right? But this is something that, you know, is an alternative to years and years of litigation and millions of dollars in attorney's fees, right? Is approaching your municipality and saying, we think you're in violation. Is this something you can voluntarily comply with?
Yeah, and put it in writing.
Yes, and put it in writing.
Thank you so much. We have a few minutes left, and so I first want to thank the Argus Hotel for hosting us, and I want to thank our incredible panel, David and Amy. And so we have a few minutes left, and I want to just, you know, extend my appreciation to everyone at Unite New York and everyone who's watching our live stream as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Yes, always up for questions.